This is the Marketing Made Easy for HR Consultants podcast, a show to help independent HR consultants get a pipeline of perfect fit, high-paying clients without expensive adverts, time-consuming social media activities, or energy-sapping and monotonous networking meetings. I'm your host, Nick Paninsky, author of How to Land Your Dream Client, a book which explains everything you need to know to get every sale and client you ever want. And if that sounds interesting, then make sure to grab your copy from the influential consultant website today. That being said, let's get into today's show. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Marketing Made Easy for HR Consultants. Today, we are joined by Emma Jenkings, who is from Mosaic Mediation. Emma is an accredited workplace mediator, conflict coach, DISC practitioner, mediator mentor, and interpersonal skills trainer. She's been self-employed for over 8 years now and has worked with all manner of organisations from the NHS to micro businesses in her local area and all over the UK. Emma loves equipping individuals and organisations to peacefully prevent, manage and resolve conflict. And in her spare time, she's a mum of 2, has a rescue dog from Cyprus, and runs a local community choir. Thanks for joining us today, Emma.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It was great. You know, obviously we met when I gave you a cold call, and
Yes, so did. Well. Yeah,
we got along so well. I said, what you do will be a great topic for my audience, and then obviously you were very humble and agreed to be a guest on my show.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Excellent. So talk to me briefly about this choir of yours. I'm really intrigued. What is a local community choir? Where is this? Tell me about it.
Well, I live in Gosport, which is a little seaside town in Hampshire. It's right down on the south coast of England. And I don't know, I mean, I've always done singing and played piano, and there's a lot of people who I know who love to sing, and I just thought my girls are growing up and they love to sing, but I didn't want it to be like a children's choir. I didn't want it to be just for adults, and I also didn't want it to be something where people had to audition and they felt they had to sing like Mariah Carey to get in or any of that kind of thing. More than anything, I was just aware of the benefits for mental health and well-being and just community spirit that you get from singing with another, with groups of people. There's so much evidence out there about the positive benefits of doing that. And I make it as fun as possible. And we sing Disney songs and songs from the 60s and rock songs. And we just do the whole, any kind of song that people like will sing, and people are dancing away and the kids are doing little pirouettes in front. And yeah, it's just such a feel good thing that I do in my spare time. And it's once a month and I love it. And the people who come just come every single time because they get so much of a buzz out of coming.
That's awesome. When you told me you ran the community choir, like I had this idea in my mind, this, dusty church hall, OAPs and some biscuits and some cups of tea and whatnot. But it sounds more like a party.
Oh, it is. It's definitely a party atmosphere that's family friendly. So it's really, really good. I love it. And it's, it's one of those things that last year I feel like that's when I started it at the beginning of last year. And it was one of the best things I did because, people just get so much from it and it's lovely. It's such a good atmosphere. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Speaking of people getting so much from it, I think that's a nice bridge to talk about, mediation. Because I think, it's one of those important things. And, I think that, when we met, we had that quick conversation. So, if you don't mind, let's get into it. Let's talk about mediation.
I mean, I first heard about mediation. I did a law degree and I heard about it then. And that really intrigued me, this idea of one person being neutral rather than being a solicitor where you're advocating just for one side. And it just caught me. I did my dissertation on family mediation. I then went on to work at the Employment Tribunal. And it was there that you kind of see the two sides, and you think actually these could be two very different stories, two completely different events. And you think, oh, surely if someone could have just got them in the room and helped them talk about this, they wouldn't end up needing to go to the tribunal. And so that kind of stayed with me while I was working there. And I loved working at the employment tribunal. I absolutely loved it. But it definitely kind of triggered this thing of, I need to look into mediation more. And essentially what mediation is having one person who is neutral. They have no stake in what's going to happen next. They're not invested in it. Then they're probably not going to meet these people again. And that obviously for internal mediation, that's slightly different. But as an external mediator, that's my role, is I go in and then I leave. And that means that these people tend to really lower their guard down when they're talking to me. We have a lot of venting at the beginning, just myself and these individuals privately. Nothing they say to me is shared unless I've spoken to them about it first and got express permission. About the minute detail, I check with them before I share it with anyone else. And even then, if they've given me permission, I'll only share it if it feels like it's important to do so. So there's this real sense of like, although I'm neutral, I'm actually pro both of them. So I want them to come out of the mediation and there be some progress in the situation. So generally what we do is I'll have those individual conversations first. And then with a workplace mediation, it tends to be a whole day. But with micro and small businesses, I do an hourly situation for them if that's what they prefer or that's what they need to, depending on their budget. And then we try and have a joint conversation. And it doesn't mean that we're necessarily in the same room for 5 hours or something like that. I'll go between and there'll be breaks and I'll talk to individuals and, we'll see whether it's comfortable for people to speak together. But essentially what I'm trying to do as a mediator is help them have a productive conversation in a peaceful way. That means that they each feel listened to and we get to the bottom of what's caused this, but then also how do we draw a line and move on from it? And that's something which a lot of the more structured processes, because mediation is very flexible, those structured processes are not often geared towards helping people reconnect and understand each other. They're often geared to finding out information. So for me, mediation is about figuring out how do people feel a little bit more understood? How does someone hear an alternative perspective to their own and be a bit more open to that? And then how do they feel a lot better about their situation afterwards?
Super interesting. So then this would kind of be like a little bit different than a grievance, right? Because, I've worked in HR and obviously you've got experience of it. So grievance, someone's got a complaint, they send in that complaint and then the investigators go to work, So how do you differ from a grievance?
Well, I mean, often in my experience, I tend to come in when a grievance has happened. So often a result or an outcome of a grievance is let's try mediation. My preference would be if someone is raising an issue, that's the key time to get in with mediation then before the grievance process. Because again, the grievance process is often about information. And in that time where you're doing the information gathering, people are still in their feelings about what's happened and in their feelings now about this process. So when I get to the mediation after a grievance, then normally I'm having to work through the process of the grievance alongside why they kicked off the grievance in the first place. So it becomes way more complicated. It's obviously possible, and I've done it very successfully for those situations, but it's certainly more complicated for them to have to process both things, grievance process and what led to them raising a grievance in the first place. There is a place for grievances, but I would love for mediation to happen first. But with the grievance process, what tends to happen is it's information gathering, and often people are told not to speak to each other during that time. And, that's what I hear a lot. And also people don't often know what's happening. So they may have been asked a few questions, but they're not sure what's happening on this side. And then they hear a little bit of the outcome here, but it feels like there's lots of gaps in their experience of what's going on. And what's happened, and what do people now think about me having done this? That's a big thing. What do people think about me now that someone's raised this grievance against me, or I've raised this? Do they think I'm being petty? There's a lot of that kind of mind games thing that they kind of are working through as well during that time. Whereas mediation is about trying to fill in those gaps of understanding, and if they've got a question, then they have the opportunity to ask it. And those processes often don't have room for that, understandably, because it's about information gathering.
That's a big difference, isn't it? Because the grievance is separate, whereas a mediation is more together.
Exactly. And it's that thing like what you did with your hands. Grievance is like you stay apart for a bit while we're figuring out the information. Mediation is like, let's come together and see what's actually gone on here. I mean, 9 times out of 10, there's been misunderstandings and assumptions that have been made that we need to correct. And, and time does not heal all wounds when it comes to conflict. Like, it just absolutely is the worst thing. A bit of time to settle emotions is fine. More than that, that's beyond just letting them settle down a bit. It just cements those ideas that they may have about the other person. And then it becomes really hard to unpick that, even if the evidence is staring them in the face that their assumption was not correct. For me, I love that mediation can happen really quick. If someone calls me up tomorrow and says, if I can get you calls with the parties, over the next couple of days, could you be with us on Monday? Then I could, and it's done and dusted. And people like that they can quickly get to the bottom of things, talk about, they've had these conversations in the shower. Do you know what I mean? In their mind with this other person, they've run through this in their head. Mediation means you get to sit down and do it. And I make sure that people are not, verbally attacked, and they feel psychologically safe in the room. And if they want to only talk through me, then we'll do that. We'll do shuttle mediation, and I go between rooms, even virtually between rooms. So it's really flexible, but people still come out of it knowing a little bit more about where the other person was coming from, and try and be, quite productive with that time. What are we going to do next? How are you going to feel better when you go back to work and you're still going to see this person?
Yeah, I think that's the big advantage is, as well as in theory, if you get that problem flagged before it becomes a grievance, then, you can just deal with it nice and quickly, get people together. The old phrase, knock their heads together, get to the bottom of the situation. So, as far as I'm aware, it's a very worthy process. I think I've only ever experienced it working in HR. I've only experienced it as an internal person. So, I remember a few people, that I had to get in a room together and try and iron out before it went to a grievance stage. But you've got a completely different perspective, right? Because you're external. So what are the advantages of going with someone who's external rather than someone who is internal? Help us understand.
I'd say that there are some practical reasons why it helps sometimes. So sometimes I'll have HR people who are trained and good at it, but they have a lot on their plate. So they'll go, right, I need to be doing this process because we're suddenly, doing like a massive change in the organization, and I need to be on top of this. Then they'll outsource it to me. So that's one thing, is just practically time. Also then, if they are a smaller business, or they're likely to meet the person quite regularly, perhaps they might be, if they're in the middle of like a grievance process or a disciplinary process, then it would be a very unusual and probably not the best idea, in my opinion, to be that person for those types of processes, plus be the mediator. It just, the neutrality aspect really loses ground there. And also, that what I was saying before, that I fly in and fly out, people do really lower their guard, and they talk to me about all sorts of things that have been going on in their life that, they potentially wouldn't want to share with someone, as nice as they may be, who they are probably going to bump into, 3 or 4 times a week, every day while they're at that job. So whereas they know that I'm coming in, I'm doing this, I'm leaving.
They can say whatever they want.
Yeah, and at no point will my career be impacted by what they say, or by, if my career changes, I'm not going to be the one deciding if they get a pay rise, or how to manage their absence or anything like that. So there's a real separation there that I think a lot of parties really benefit from, and the organizations tend to as well. You tend to get a much better result if there could be some kind of conflict. However, saying that, I do train people in internal mediation, because I think it's a really worthy thing. And I think if it's, like you were saying, let's have this conversation nice and quickly. Let's nip this in the bud, figure out what's going on here. Let's get to the bottom of it. But as soon as you start to get a little bit more complex, perhaps as well, there is an element of frustration about how the organization, beyond this other person that they're dealing with, may have dealt with something, or, changes in management and things like that. That kind of stuff can be quite tricky to talk about in a mediation if that person was part of that process. So it just, that separation can be really beneficial at times, both for the practical elements of the processes and time, but also just the ability to enable people to lower their guard.
Yeah, I think as well, like, you'll be external, so nobody will have any preconceived ideas or perceptions of who you are, right? So, back in the day when I worked in HR, people would say, "Oh, Nick from HR," and they would have a certain impression. They would have feelings towards me. Whereas you are a blank slate. They have, so, there's no worries about how they are, what you're going to say to them. They don't have any thoughts about that.
And I work really hard, even being an external mediator, to gain their trust around the fact that I'm not going to share what they tell me. That's really important to people. And I know, having spoken to people who have done internal mediation, that they have to work that extra bit harder to demonstrate, I'm not going to share this. This is totally confidential. Because workplace gossip is a thing, unfortunately. And if you've experienced it, even if it's not from that internal mediator, but if you have experienced it at all, then there is often a thing in your head kind of going, but what if they let something slip when they're talking to someone about this situation? So it just kind of gets rid of that a little bit. And like I said, I'm in, I'm out. And also, one of the really powerful techniques of a mediator is asking good questions. And some of those questions work really well when they're what I would call quite naive questions. And I can do that. I can go in and say, "Oh, so what does your day look like? So, tell me more about that team." Whereas if I was part of the organization, it would be weird if I asked some of those questions, because you'd anticipate that I'd know those answers. But I can ask those naive questions, and they can be really good at building trust and rapport. But also, if there's, slight escalation happening in the discussion, I can ask something quite naively, and immediately it just simmers down a little bit.
Nice. Oh, I like that. So, Emma, I've got 2 questions for you left. Maybe, I guess let me start off with what should people be looking for inside their organization if to try and nip a situation in the bud, before it gets raised as a grievance, before it gets formed, before there's a situation that, has to be dealt with in a process. So help us out. What are the signs?
I'd say when people start avoiding another person, then that's a sign. Like, they don't have to be shouting or aggressive for conflict to cause huge damage in an organization. So if someone is trying to avoid the other person, something needs to to change there. So whether that is they're avoiding them because they did something that was, unprofessional conduct or anything like that, there could be something really reasonable about why they're avoiding this person, but that means that something's happened that needs to be tackled. And also, if they are avoiding them because they don't know how to have that conversation, that is my role. If sometimes in a mediation, people will come to me and they'll go and they'll say, "Can I just chat to you for a second?" We'll take them to one side and they say, "I want to talk about this, but I don't want to get them upset, or I'm worried about their reaction," or something like that. I don't know how to phrase it. Then I help them using their words, but maybe, how can we frame this in a way? And I'll chat, coach them through it, really. So mediation offers a way to kind of, for people who want to talk but don't know how to say it, then mediation offers them that as well. So, and some of these conversations that I have are not where people really hate each other. They're not.
No.
It's just that they are struggling to communicate effectively. So people avoiding each other is a big one for me. Obviously,
we're terrible for that as well in England, especially we avoid conflict like mad. We don't really speak our minds, I hate to drone on about it. I've been in South America, right? They are direct. They tell you. They don't mess around. I was in Poland before that. They're direct. They don't mess around. Whereas here, we dance around topics, I think there's that Twitter page, very British problems or something. All the different ways we say no.
Without actually saying no.
Without actually saying no. Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's and
it's so common. And often, the way I approach mediation is not thinking that I've got two baddies or one baddie in a room and one goodie, and none of that. Most people want to go about their lives, have good relationships, get on with their job, and go home and do fun things in the evening. Most people are not setting out to make their colleagues miserable. So for me, I always go in trying to understand, well, what's happened here that's gone awry. And so, that avoiding each other, obviously, the really clear things, if they're starting to have arguments in the office, or they hear something back from a client that, people clearly there was some tension going on there. But nipping it in the bud right at the beginning, a little bit of tension, a little bit of avoiding, just that little pulling to one side. Anything going on between you guys? All good? Do you need me to kind of get involved at all? Do you feel like you can have this conversation directly with them? Encouraging direct communication first. Then if they need help, bit of help. But if it comes more complicated, or actually there's a few different layers to the situation, they're unwilling to have a conversation together, then external mediation makes sense. It just makes sense.
Yeah, I like that you've talked about that, because that is literally going to be my last question, is going to be what are those steps that people should follow if they want to do the mediation themselves? So, my audience, people listening in right now, they're independent HR consultant, but there may be other people listening. So how would they handle mediation if they want to do it? What have you got, a 5-step process or something? Is there a step 2 do this, step 3 do this? And obviously it's a flexible process. So
this is it. It's a flexible process. I think the first thing is check that you're the right person to do it. That's really key, because a mediation
is that a psychological thing, or is that like a verbal thing? Is that
I'd say a mixture. Like? So firstly, internally, do I have, or does it look like I have a closer relationship with one person than the other?
Perfect. Yeah.
So and the look like is just as important as do I have. Because if the looks like you're close, I've had this in me, when I've come to do an external mediation following a blow up of an internal mediation, where the mediator that they'd chosen and one of the parties were not particularly close, but the other party had seen them together a few times and assumed that there was a friendship there, and nothing they could do would deter them from believing that. So really check that not just you have a closer relationship with one than the other, but that it may look like you do. If it looks like, I would avoid. And perhaps a colleague who's also trained may be good as well. I would say mediation skills are really important if you're going to do mediation. So if you are a great listener, then that is great. But I'd say for the well-being of yourself, then it makes total sense to get trained, because it can be quite a heavy thing to do. So I would also recommend getting trained. If you have not got training, but you just want to have one of those informal conversations, then the key thing with neutrality is to not be or come across as judgmental. So you stick to listening, you stick to asking questions, and you don't give advice. Those are 3 really key things. Listen, questions, no advice. Because if you're going to be neutral, the key thing is for them to kind of understand what's going on here and try and get in a problem-solving mindset themselves. Don't hand them the solution. So that's really key. And then make sure you speak to each person separately first. Really important.
Get the lay of the land from each perspective.
And the opportunity for someone to vent is key for them to being able to then have a productive conversation. So people will say things when they're having a conversation with me. They may call them names. They may swear during the conversation. They may be really het up and angry. They may cry. And all of that is absolutely fine. All of that is fine. And I receive that without judgment, because I know that it's part of the process. And then when you're having those conversations with them, set ground rules. This is how we're going to speak with each other respectfully. This is what that looks like. I will interrupt if need be. I will ask questions, but I'm doing it from this perspective. The aim is to try and get a win-win out of this, where you both feel like you've been listened to, and that we've got, we can have some actions going forward that make you feel better about the situation.
Nice.
So make sure that if they have that venting, there is a point where you start going, right, do you feel ready to draw a line here and start looking at what we can do next? Because you don't want people to just stay in the venting stage.
No.
Because that will just keep going outside of the mediation. Yeah. And also the confidentiality over everything else. Unless there's a safeguarding issue there, then you need to make sure that people know that it's confidential and that they treat it as confidential as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So those are the things that I would urge. Yeah.
So you understand the situation from each person's perspective, separate conversations. Yeah. Then you get them together, you explain the rules, and then who wants to start? Is that would that be the goal?
Yeah. And often I will talk with them beforehand and see who wants to go first. Or or if someone has raised an issue, I often invite them to go first, because, often the other person is sitting there going, why are we even here? So it's quite important to start with, let's figure out why we're here in the first place.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that. And then how do you draw a meeting to an end? Do you have like a set time limit? Is this like a full day thing or a half day thing? 1 hour, 20 minutes?
So I would say it depends on the complexity. So it may be, if you are able to get into a situation really quickly to nip it in the bud, I don't know, it could be an hour and a half, could be done. But as in the joint session, I would, make sure that you do the separate conversations first, and then schedule a time to do the joint session. But I allow a day. I allow a working day for a workplace mediation. I do mediations that, maybe it's a smaller business, and they say, can you just give us 5 hours? I go, yep, that's fine. And I've done a micro business mediation not that long ago. They wanted just 3 hours. So I was like, okay. But what I do in that, because of, this experience that I have, I kind of know where we're going to get to. So I'll say, right, these are the things we're going to talk about. Having listened to both of you, these are what we're going to focus on. We can't expect to try and cover this, and this, because we're not going to have an effective, productive conversation then. So if you're going to do a short amount of time, you need to set the expectations about what you think can get covered in that time, because it sounds like a really long amount of time to do a whole day, but it flies. It really flies by. Yeah. And it is draining. So it does have an impact all of that time, but it goes really quickly. So and the worst thing you could have is to set a mediation for a few hours and you get to a really good point and then everyone's got a meeting. So they have to leave. I mean, that's horrendous. So you want to allow enough time to make sure you have a chance to have conversations, be prepared for it not to just be a linear conversation as well. You'll have points where you feel like you're getting somewhere and then it goes back a bit and then it goes back a bit. So, be aware of that, allow enough time, allow time for them to put the wording together. If you're going to put anything in writing, they are crucial to the wording of that document. So I don't write the document, I help them craft it.
Okay. Yeah.
And then they take ownership of what's going in, agree what's going to be said afterwards to other people if they ask. All of those, there are so many steps that I've brought into my process. But generally speaking, make sure that in a mediation, you're the right person to do it. The parties feel listened to and heard. You have something productive that means you have progress. It doesn't mean that they've resolved everything, but there is progress. That's my key word now for concluding a mediation, is that if there has been progress, that is success.
Yes.
Because you can't expect people to suddenly trust someone within a day. If it's been 18 months of hell for them, then they can't suddenly trust this person. So it's all about being absolutely okay with steps that mean things are going to improve.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. That makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all that, because that is going to really add value for the HR consultants who listen to this show, because either A, they're going to deal with the mediation themselves and now they're better equipped for it, or B, they're going to say, Emma, where do we find out more, Emma, if we need to hire you?
Well, I've got a website, so www.mosaicmediation.co.uk, and you can fill in an inquiry form. You can book directly into my calendar if you want to have a chat. And often what I will do, because I do mediation, but there's also loads of other ways you can sort a situation out. Then I normally try and chat with the person first before just kind of diagnosing mediation straight away, because there could be other things along the way that are more appropriate. So I'm always up for having a conversation about a situation, no obligation for anything going further than that.
Oh, perfect. Excellent. So they can get in contact with you, say, listen, I think I've got this kind of a situation. Is mediation the right step forward? And then so you can use your expertise to say, actually, in this case, no, mediation's not right.
Yeah, okay, you could try this, you could try that, speak to this person. I'll always have something that they can go away with. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And if someone wants to learn how to be a mediator, then you can teach them and you can mentor them and
so I've got a business that I do with a couple of other mediators where we've got training for mediation, and I also just teach mediation skills as well. And and I run a group called Bloom Mediator Mentoring. You can find us on LinkedIn, and we run a monthly session that's completely free online, and that's for mediators of any specialism, and whether they are internal mediators or external mediators. It's all about just developing your skills and having a community of people who support you.
Perfect. I like that. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Emma. I really appreciate it. It's been very insightful, very interesting. I think that when I used to do my mediation, I didn't do as much as what you've just shared there. So I was obviously doing it badly.
No. As long as you got a good result, that's the key thing.
We made progress. I remember that much.
Yeah,
So,
that's the key thing. That is key. Yeah,
that's it. Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us today, Emma. Perhaps we can have you on the show again at some point in the future. Perhaps you can share some of the stories. I'm sure that would be
I've got
a bit the names, obviously.
Yeah.
Anonymity. But I think it's always interesting to hear, the value you added right at the start, where the situation was, and what that situation was looking like for an organization. And then when you went in, what changed, all that good stuff, what the end result for an organization looks like. Because I think that's one thing that we haven't managed to talk about today is what the value of mediation is. And I think obviously you're the expert, so I'll let you tackle that one. But for me, it's a loss of employee turnover, increased productivity, all those buzzwords.
Yeah. And you think about the investment you put into your employees. Moving to another team does not make the problem go away. It just doesn't. And so it's investing in them. It's a moment where a lot of people learn a lot about themselves if it's done well. So you will hopefully get a better employee out of it as well. You have better relationships. They learn about conflict and conflict management. And those other processes that we've talked about cost huge amount of time. So much time puts it, having been in HR, the effort that you have to put in to do a grievance, a disciplinary process, and all of those things. And, I take that time away. And having worked at the tribunal, I know how long it takes for a case to happen and the cost that can go into it, because you don't have to have representation, but most people do. So there is a real, financial cost as well. So mediation is quicker, flexible, it's voluntary, it's confidential, and there's no judgment. It just makes sense to me. Yeah.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you for joining us today, Emma. I know Emma shared earlier, she's got her website. I'll put the link in the show notes, so if you have any issues and you want to reach out to her. But in the meantime, thank you for being the guest, and thank you for listening to the show. Bye for now.
Bye.
Hey there, and thanks for listening to the Marketing Made Easy for HR Consultant podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, then please consider taking a moment to help us grow by sharing the episode with a friend or colleague, or by leaving a positive review on podchaser.com. And make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming episodes. I've been your host, Nick Paninsky, and if you have any questions or want to know more about today's topic, then reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd be delighted to hear from you. See you next time.